Spectroactive. Good dawn, great dusk, half-decent noon, and wholly heavenly night. Welcome to Spectroactive, an internet-based broadcast styled around static talking heads that skates sporadically over the surface of the maddeningly mercurial tech industry in an effort to blend practical insight with objective advice without being influenced by a treacherous tsunami of trends or dwelling in deep waters long enough to be convinced that only one colossal corporate clipper can safely, productively, and indefinitely negotiate a ravenous ocean of commercial exorbitance that would otherwise pitch, toss, and swallow any abject consumer foolish enough to jump ships. Or flagships. This anonymous episode's terminally stationary guest is none other than self-serving hardware hoarder and techo chamber no-tuber Henry Halsworth. And our sole pre-planned cry for advice originates from Portsmouth, on the sunny coast of southwest England, and one Bill Tilden, who writes,
I've had a Titan RTX for almost 2 years, was given it free by a patron who said he bought it to use as a paperweight but didn't like the colour and just missed the 14-day distance selling regs refund window. Imagine that. Anyway, as an architect by trade, I use it for a combination of ProCAD work, 3D rendering, machine learning, R&D for my sister's AI IT recruitment company, Bitcoin mining, home medical research, and a bit of casual gaming when I've got time. But just last month, I was also donated a Samsung QN900A Neo QLED 8K TV. 65 inches is way too small for my brother's 50-foot home office and gym, and he just missed the deadline for Curry's 21-day no-quibble money-back guarantee. Now, I remember when NVIDIA launched the RTX 3090, they told us it was a Titan-class GPU that could deliver a smooth gaming experience in 8K. And since I'll be sticking this screen beside an Odyssey Neo G9 I bought last week for half the price to double up as a secondary monitor and television, I wondered if it was worth my upgrading, or will the Titan be fast enough till my bro gives me his 3090? Because as soon as the M1 Ultra Mac Pro turns up, he says he's going full Apple, and by then I'll have probably got a 4090 Ti anyway. All love-laced up, so to speak.
Well, first we have to expressly interpret and define the terms fast and smooth. Did I tell you to speak? Well, it seemed like we'd finally reached a question, so I was just trying.
And how do you know the letter's finished?
Do excuse me, a brief and rare attack of mindless optimism. It has. I was just reminding you who is in charge. Okay, well, if by fast we mean high frame rates and smooth refers to a total absence of microstutter, then are both of these visual qualities essential to formally constitute objective smoothness, or is 30 FPS with zero choppiness visually smoother than 60 FPS with intermittently longer intervals between complete image renders, resulting in a higher percentage of individual frames populating the screen for longer than 1/30th of a second? He said 60 frames per second in 8K. That seems pretty clear, but input latency, artifacts, and render time fluctuations could still contrive to make that feel sluggish. Oh, get out! Indeed, if by smooth gaming experience we refer to 4 handsomely paid-off bit-part actors billed as professional streamers alternately gawking in awe at a sequence of NVIDIA-optimized AAA titles whilst thumbing and fingering their unwired D-paired discharged joypads and respectively exclaiming, "Whoa! Amazing! This is incredible! Insane! 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 Times 40 ad infinitum," then yes, feel proud, privileged, and vindicated to part with over 2,000 piffling pounds of pocket padding. Moreover, unless the 3D applications you're using happen to employ very similar rendering techniques and algorithms to those simulated within SpecVuperf's CATIA and Siemens NX benchmarks, then an upgrade will garner you unconditional performance gains. But regarding the primary reason for our questioner's dire quandary, even though Barkus Brownlee, Sinus Lebastian, and a blatantly bribed Beeve Namers Gexus Sturk have all comprehensively addressed the Emerald Empire's bold declaration, few, if any, have hosted a play-by-play pixel punch-out between Team Turing's True Titan and Clan Ampere's Titanic Pretender.
Actually, Linus did, in the video you just referenced.
Yes, but not in any games.
No, in 3 games, I think you'll find.
Well, that's not enough for a constructive perspective.
It's enough for 14 million subscribers.
Sure, but evidently not the other 1.9 billion on YouTube.
Yes, but they're not all tech enthusiasts.
A large percentage are, and that bifurcates into progressively fanatical niches, so it's worth a shot. Plus, we never saw any split-screen comparisons.
And who needs those when charts and graphs tell you double as much in a fraction of the time whilst expending a scintilla of the server space?
Well, then why upload them to YouTube in a 20-minute 4K video when you could conserve even more by publishing them to a website in a traditional text-based review? Have all these influencers eulogizing over optimal key travel and scissor-switch sublimity genuinely forgotten how to type? Look, I'll be damned if I don't derive some vaguely original and compelling content from this atypical inquiry, and for once manage to broadcast it while the subject matter remains remotely on trend. Unless you happen to be watching this in 2025. In which case, how are you doing with that hyper-wide Megadef 80-inch 24K Samsung Millennia G12 monitor? Oh, and let me tell you why you shouldn't buy the iPhone 18. And what happened to those Teslas that launched a class action against Elon Musk for wrongful recall? Did they ever get to depose him, or is he still self-extraditing on Mars? Suffice it to say, what better opportunity to hoist Mr. Huang on his own lofty petard before he shamelessly attempts to sweep it under a Gen 3 deep-learned super-aliased RTX version 2.0 hardcore accelerated ray-traced rug, and assert with a candidly contrived, commercially compatible sincerity, "To all my Fahrenheit, Celsius, Kelvin, Rankine, Marie Curie, Tesla, Fermi, Kepler, Maxwell House, Pascal, Voltarola, Turing, and Ampere friends, it is safe to remortgage now." And 10,000 gigaflops of gratitude to nouveau.freedesktop.org for compiling that invaluable chronology of GPU monikers, for which I still shed nostalgic tears of joy.
I see. And how precisely do you propose to preserve the footage for analysis and presentation? H.264 taps out at 4K. Redcode RAW and ProRes aren't options to you, and even if they were, there's no affordable capture card that supports resolutions that high.
NVIDIA Shadow Play, of course.
No, no good. H.265 native format. All 8K would be downsampled and recorded at UHD.
Well, not according to Epoch's Vox. Look, there's the option, as clear as a glint in an emerald eye.
You might want to check your own control panel. 8K capture is single card only.
Listen, let us cease all this pixel procrastination and make haste to the benchmarks before Jensen tacks a tie on the end of this pseudo-titan to flog another Titanic Pretender that no influencer without a gigantic Patreon slush fund and a tinormous portfolio of VPN, male grooming, metal wallet, memory foam mattress, dubious fantasy role-playing, stroke gamified gambling with fashionably exorbitant non-refundable upgrade sponsors can afford.
Why not just get Apex Omnipass?
Shut up. Let's keep this concise and to the super sample pixel. Hung's precise quote was, "The 3090 is so big that for the very first time we can play games at 60 frames per second in 8K. Quite apart from the fact that a GPU's larger size is not inextricably linked to its elevated performance.
Couldn't you just say bigger isn't always better?
No, but I could say fatter isn't always faster. Has he forgotten what Kepler did to Fermi, or what Maxwell did to Kepler Refresh, or what Pascal did to Maxwell, or what Turing did to... Yeah, well, I suppose it all got a bit big massive after that. But let us divert from digression, drive back Jensen's outlandish declaration, which is about as open to subjective interpretation as recursively ray-traced abstract art. How many corporate carnivores can you spot? We can play games at 60 frames per second in 8K, he boldly proclaims. But how many games? For how long? And indeed, returning to Henry's valid, if pedantically conveyed point, with or without ludicrous input lag or murderous microstutter. Based on a broad gamut of benchmarks conducted by YouTube's most prolific tech tinkerers, we have shamelessly plagiarized a pixel-perfect list of top-tier AAA titles, some politically partial to AMD, others profitably partnered with Nvidia. In the interests of preserving precious time that no big spender could afford to squander, we have filtered this suite to include solely games which feature an indigenous benchmarking utility, since I'm loath to faff around with cumbersome console commands or manually log results with RivaTuner statistics server, other than perhaps for the sake of retrospectively RTX'd nostalgia. Would that be Quake 2? The very same. For each test, we shall pose a trio of pertinent questions intended to hold Mr. Huang's feet to the FinFET foundry. 1. Can the game in question run at 60 frames per second for over 60 seconds? 2. If yes, do those 60 frames per second for at least 60 seconds constitute an objectively smooth playing experience? And 3. If solely for the sake of pointlessly extravagant and hopelessly obsolete niche novelty, is SLI over NVLink either A. supported and B. to a measurably beneficial degree? And how do you intend to verify that? By showing the footage and letting our 4 viewers judge for themselves. I'd say 4 is a tad optimistic. Well, more's the pity for the 4 billion who prefer having their brains scrambled by indecipherably dense bar charts. Oh, fret not, there'll be a stack of those for the hardest core stat junkies. Let us commence with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the 12th AAA title in an epic saga of progressively fantastical action RPGs, initially revolving around the dearly deceased contract killer Desmond Miles, who perished at the end of the 3rd game, and steeped in more Norse mythology than you could shake Siegfried's sword at after Brunhilde had used it to hack off Hagen's head. Oh, Lord, please, not another one of these confounded house-branded bloatware-ridden launchers that just wants to be Steam, or the Microsoft Store, or Google Play. Why can't they just all use Steam, or the Microsoft Store, or Google Play, and spare me the insufferable rigmarole of setting up 12 separate user accounts with a dozen 24-character passwords and quad-factor biometric authentication? At last, we're in. Wait. Why has it frozen at the splash screen? Ah, it hasn't. It was just an epic tease. Hold up. Where's my cursor? I don't have epilepsy, and even if I did, I'd have read this warning by now. Why can't I skip all of this pre-rendered branding? Don't tell me things I already know. Why doesn't the any key have any effect? Stop checking for add-ons I couldn't care less about. Please, just put my pointer back on the screen, or do I really need a joypad to get past the main menu? Praise be! Finally, a benchmark button. Let us rock those ROPs and ampere up the teraflops. So tell me, 60 FPS? At the high profile with every setting left unaltered? Nah. An objectively smooth playing experience? Maybe to a stalwart cinephile who refuses to watch anything but 70mm prints on remastered deluxe director's cut Blu-rays at 23.9899999999998 frames per second. But when doubling up, are those dual GPUs reporting for duty? Oh yes, but one is, shall we say, somewhat slacking. Fine. Then let Turing's true titan trace a seamless path to the pearly gates. Does our frame counter summit the sacred 60? Well, if I were to round up like a Wall Street trader... Quite. How about objective smoothness? Well, perhaps perceptibly less chop and chug, but at a rate of 16 FPS, the entire sequence is verging on a slideshow. So, would you rather higher lows with lower highs, or higher highs with lower lows? I'm sorry. The stats show Ampere sweeping all 3 stakes. We can disregard the figure for maximum as spurious, but the Titan's frame trace appears significantly less spiky, strongly evidencing a reduced variance in render intervals and proving that a lower rate can indeed evoke tangibly smoother visuals if a greater proportion of images occupy the screen for identical periods. Right, so super-sampled swings and upscaled roundabouts. Not really, no. And does a Titanic tag team turn stutter into butter? Statistically improved scaling, no degradation in smoothness, and a staggering speed boost of 25%. which sounds so much more impressive than 4 frames per second, but all very likely by default and not designed, since this is clearly not an SLI optimized title. Next, please. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Coincidentally, another Chapter 12 in a fragmented story arc dating back to 1996, and whose original installment served as a stellar showcase for the very earliest dedicated 3D GPUs. 8K restricted to 30 Hz. That's an auspicious start. You honestly believe it's going to bottleneck at that res? With DLSS enabled perhaps? Then just disable VSync. Oh, of course. Why didn't I think of that? Hyper high def LoRa, here we come. A black screen. An AWOL pointer. Unskippable copywriting credit screens. I have a haunting sense of deja vu. We're in. What a relief. There are indeed occasions when contemporary digitally distributed games feel like they're loading off cassette. There's another box of promotional piffle that makes a paperweight's autobiography seem interesting. No free trial, please. I wouldn't want to click a deceptively positioned buy it now link. Let's just get benchmarking before a crash to desktop. These fans are howling like Fender feedback through a Marshall amp. Ah yes, don't we all recall this revolutionary rendition of ravishing aesthetics? A scene which supposedly debuted the visual virtues of real-time ray tracing in all their resplendent incandescence. As we commence our unobserved tour around an ornately illuminated town square, where local residents convivially gather to partake in a night of tipples, tangos and social festivities, pillars and walls festooned in decorative lights, as enchanted children flourish torches and brandish sparklers, painting glimmering shades over flickering shadows and evoking ambient occlusion in alluring abundance. Lara's fringe flutters in the velvet breeze as she wanders aimlessly amidst oblivious company, stopping near a fountain and fixing her glacial gaze upon a boy with his mother, perhaps pondering her own aptitude as a parent were it not that her chosen path through life so perpetually fraught with peril, but far more concerned with the proverbial question, is RTX on or off? When you're done with your audition for Square Enix's lead audio describer, please let me know. Quick, tell me, 60 frames per second for our counterfeit Colossus? For about 10 seconds a minute? Yes. So 85% short of our stated target time, but encouraging that Team Greed's top dog might have uttered a scintilla of truth. Would you like to see what happens at ultra high? No, let's remain scrupulously impartial. Nothing in his statement implied any game would be playable with maxed out details, and to infer as such might be considered unreasonable. But is the sensory experience a case of lumpy custard or whipped cream? A scattering of stutters, but with intolerance for most, and very likely to be filtered out with G-Sync. Well, let's enable G-Sync. We can't, this monitor doesn't support it. Why? It's a Dell UP3218K, came out in spring of 2017, one of their premier color range, calibrated for gamut coverage and accuracy within professional AV applications. So, since G-Sync is considered almost exclusively a gamer's luxury, it wasn't integrated. Right, so what 8K monitors do cater for G-Sync? None as I speak, only televisions. Such as, in theory, any with HDMI 2.1, the Samsung QN900 donated to our questioner being one example, but officially only those expressly promoted by specific manufacturers or that appear on Nvidia's certified list. And how many are there of the latter? None. But what about these two giant LG screens? The Z1s, they're G-Sync compatible. Compatible does not equal certified and guarantees nothing beyond an option to enable the function. And as I speak, the Z2s have yet to be launched. Correct. So which display did Jensen use for the demo? Likely one of the Z1's ancestors. You mean the ZX? Spectrum? Just a joke. Yep, the very same, or possibly the 2019 Z9. Neither of which was anywhere on this list at Ampere's launch. Apparently so, but are now, though again uncertified. So, to summarise, Nvidia's founding CEO made his 8K at 60 frame assertion at a time when the only 8K monitor commercially available that enabled a feature designed by his own company solely to increase and smooth out frame rates was not actually a monitor but a television costing at least $20,000 which, according to his own company, didn't, never has, and likely never will officially support this feature. Shall we press on? Yes, of course. Where were we? Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Segueing to SLI. Is that Deputy Ampere shadowing its boss? Far better than I expected. Occupancy consistently between 70 and 95% for each GPU, which translates to a scaling efficiency of approximately 75%, and thus raises frame rates by roughly 50% over a single card. And above Saint Huang's sacred 60 per second. What enterprising and virtuous marketing. To attain the advertised performance from a product, one has to invest twice as much to run it in an officially unsupported configuration. And moving from Titan Class to Titan Classic. Can the old king crush the new pretender? And does our frame counter sustain the stated 60? Divided by 2 minus 5. Oh. How about objective smoothness? Frame renders hovering in the low 40s, that's milliseconds, observable judder but no stalling. And again, curable with G-Sync? Only the connoisseurs of vintage games consoles or movie buffs with libraries of Betamax and VHS cassettes. And does a Titanic twosome transcend all expectation? Simultaneous workloads between 70 and 90% amounting to a decent hike of 18 FPS, or 40%, frame intervals cut by 10 milliseconds with stutter still present but more fluid overall. A gain of 70% over a solo GPU shows that scaling is superior to Ampere, but Turing's inferior specifications means that in terms of raw frame rate, its performance deficit increases when a second card is added. Next in the pipeline, Strange Brigade. An Aztec-enriched multiplayer third-person shooter pitting your brawn and brains against mythical monsters and mind-bending puzzles that morph in accordance with a cast of 4 cooperative characters armed with an expanding arsenal of uniquely customizable weapons. The digital box art is hauntingly reminiscent of one classic point-and-click LucasArts clone that kept me largely indoors throughout a 6-week summer school holiday, guiding the progress of one Joe King, pilot for hire. I wonder whatever happened to stories that unfolded without a dozen guns, 1,000 bangs, and dying more deaths than a lemming in a time loop. Shall we benchmark? Quite so. Do tell me, yay or nay for our requisite 60. Close, but no super-sampled cigars. 0 for 3, Mr. Huang. No matter. Can we at least salvage some smooth action? Average of 54 per second, lows hitting just under 40, and frame times hovering solidly at 20 milliseconds. 10% shy of the claim, but the nearest yet, and being scrupulously objective, you'd have to be an AMD convert to deny this qualifies as smooth. And amping things up by 100? What? Astoundingly impressive. Both GPUs virtually maxed out, render rates cut in half, and concurrent average occupancy of 94%, converting to an 87% boost over a single GPU and breaking the 100 FPS barrier. But affording some shrewd perspective, going by present retail prices, still between $30 and $40 per frame. And perhaps even more if you pay a premium for one of those Triple Fan Supreme Ultra Extreme for the Absolute Kingpin Win Edition RGB breeze blocks. Turning to Turing, what can old gold offer the gamer's fold? Do I hear 60 for a single? No. But you'd see a console-worthy 30 plus with consistent draw times and tolerably low choppiness. And how about a roaring duet? A similar story to the 3090, parallel workloads hitting their peaks, render time slashed to 60 milliseconds, a joint total utilization of 99%, and a single to double speed increase of 98. As close to scaling perfection as Oscar Peterson on a Fazioli. Excuse me. Worry not, it's called culture. Proceeding in haste to title number 4, and Rainbow Six Siege. Another strategic aim and shame affair and certified esports title. Mobilized by Ubisoft for all major consoles, with a highly sophisticated plot casting collaborative players as meticulously trained interceptors or Machiavellian members of a formidable terrorist clan known as the White Masks, and featuring missions centered around hostage liberation and bomb disposal. Creepy, creepy. Bang, bang, goes the benchmark, as we float through an eerily abandoned property, observing a series of controlled explosions as a silent SWAT team prepares to open fire on defenseless sofas and sandbags. As soon as you're finished, I have some figures. Speak freely, Stat Supremo. Does Prince Ampere fulfill King Huang's pledge? With significant interest, 78 frames per second of indisputably objective smoothness for 60 spectacular seconds and record image renders of 11 milliseconds. Well, praise the Emerald Empire, we have our first tick in the plus column. Right, and all it took was software released half a decade before the hardware. Let's not cloak ourselves in caustic pessimism. Kindly divulge the data for our dynamic duo. Well, one could hardly be optimistic in the face of such a letdown. Ampere number 2, all but AWOL, the reported total GPU load of 27% is clearly spurious. Riva Tuner suggested some simultaneous activity, but the result shows zero improvement over a single card. Would you care to kindly explain this anomaly? Yeah, having already referenced the game's age, I cautiously suggest it's a consequence of DirectX 11's inability to instigate explicit SLI, and the latter being the only means by which Ampere can employ multiple GPUs. Meaning that only touring cards and earlier will benefit from SLI in older games? Not in every case, but with DirectX 11, SLI can only be activated via NVIDIA's driver profiles, which was an ability Ampere never inherited. The fact Strange Brigade and Tomb Raider both run on DirectX 12 and are the only games thus far that we've seen manifestly utilize dual 3090s is down to their indigenous multi-GPU support. So, DirectX 11 a potential game changer in this flagship face-off. Can ye oldie Titan follow suit with a silky 60? As a soloist, no. 20 frames shy of Ampere and a couple short of the Magic 6.0. But even render times and a conspicuous absence of quirky jerky. But to sustain the suspense, can 2 towering Tourings apply ancient tricks to topple their supreme successor? Not only that, but with ROPS in reserve, 30 frames faster than a single 3090, translating to an advantage of 38%, and a 50 FPS 86% boost over its own solo run. Both GPUs pulling a 93% workload with no adverse effects upon fluidity. Team Turing 1, Ampere Inc. 3, and a 75% fail frequency in Jensen Huang's struggle with the truth. On to round 5. But first, several tasty addendums typed at the time of testing to assist other graphically disposed statisticians and anticipate the nitpicking of swivel chair pundits. Had to switch Riva Tuner's OSD coordinate space setting from viewport to frame buffer, since the game's rendering technique utilized multiple viewports, causing the application's data overlay to be positioned partially off-screen in the display's top right-hand corner. Frame pace data traces for both the RTX 3090 tests and the Titan RTX's single card benchmark showed the CPU's image render periods narrowly exceeding those of the GPU, whilst with Twin Titans running in SLI, the CPU's render times were 7 milliseconds faster. Whilst some might argue that this serves as evidence of a GPU to CPU bottleneck, if the latter were genuinely impeding performance, it would most likely be when the system had the greatest GPU power at its command. Raise the processor frequency by 600 MHz to verify it wasn't the inhibiting factor, but both frame rates, CPU and GPU occupancy remained unaltered. And now back to round 5, Watch Dogs Legion. A third-person action blastfest set in a dystopian depiction of the UK's iconic capital, with multiple players assuming roles within a network of framed hackers, attempting to emancipate both themselves, the city, and a host of fully recruitable non-playing characters from the corrupt authoritarian regime of a malevolent military organisation. How very original. Allegedly coded from its core to exhibit real-time recursive ray tracing in all its reflective glory, as borne out by this tantalizing sample. A vivid array of vibrant radiance and specular surfaces. Every shady street and shadowy alley a spellbinding study in luminous elan, lined with buildings liberally adorned in beaming billboards and scintillating neon signage, seamlessly blended with the pulsating dazzle from fallen floodlights, all casting a chorus of shimmering colour upon glowing puddles, gleaming glass, and garishly glossy paint jobs. Even on petrol-bombed cars. A uniquely poetic promotion, but might I interest you in some results? Provided they don't undermine it. Do tell, are we rolling along at 60 FPS? With fidelity at very high, as selected automatically, we're under half cranking at 25. And 1 for 4 wickets. What a doggone shame. But can perceived fluidity be our saving grace? The trace shows render times averaging at around 40 milliseconds, but the variance between long and short intervals and high and low frame rates is consistently wide, with frequent fluctuations of up to 30 milliseconds and 12 FPS. Coupled with the 1 and 0.1% minimums, this generates significant stutter throughout the sequence. Even a silent film fanatic with a cellar full of semi-restored Charlie Chaplin originals would be hard-pushed to call this smooth. Dare I ask what happens when we duel up? If you did, I'd have nothing to tell. Not a frame for better nor worse. An additional 10,000 CUDA cores idly twiddling their transistors. Isn't this another DirectX 12 title? Indeed it is, though like Assassin's Creed, evidently not one that Ubisoft's developers thought was worth the resources to optimize for multi-GPUs. Support for traditional SLI went on the steep slide after Turing launched in 2018, and NVIDIA enabled it implicitly over the NVLink interface, which was a feature formerly exclusive to their workstation products. This driver-level incarnation of SLI was officially discontinued in January 2021, leaving explicit implementation via DirectX 12 and other subsequent APIs like Vulkan at the sole discretion of third-party programmers based on development cost and market demand. In other words, about as profitable as preserving a rusty cruise liner for a payload of 4 passengers. I'm inextricably confused. Would you care to clarify? Implicit SLI means the GPU's drivers are issuing commands to the hardware based on precompiled application profiles, whilst explicit is when the API is communicating directly with components without a driver layer in between. The 3090 only ever supported SLI explicitly and was the sole Ampere card to incorporate the requisite NVLink connector. An option to enable it in the control panel remains, but in the case of DX12, all this does is initialize linked node mode, which allows the direct data exchanges and sharing of resources between 2 identical adapters that effectively present themselves to the API as a single physical GPU, whilst the drop-down menu for rendering techniques is only available with Turing. Whether the 3090 can be forced to utilize its predecessor's existing SLI profiles via registry hacks or third-party utilities is a matter open to debate, but by default, I'd be surprised if any DX11 title we're testing here benefits significantly or at all from a second card. Doesn't Watch Dogs Legion have a DX11 mode? At the sacrifice of certain effects, a more efficient shader model, and vastly improved multi-core CPU exploitation, yes. But any resulting merits pertaining to SLI would again be down to chance and not intention. But worth at least one run? No. Fair enough, all of which I'd anticipate bodes rather well for our senior siblings, but first, if solely for the sake of formality, can a solo titan top 60? Only if his name is Cronus and that 60 refers to height. In miles. But in our present context of textures and teraflops, we're limping along at a painfully pedestrian 15 FPS. More than adequate for aficionados of stop-motion animation, but can slow and steady appear satisfactorily smooth. Draw times almost doubled to 75 ms, speed reduced by 40%, but the discrepancy between fast and slow image renders and peak to base frame rates, respectively no higher than 10 milliseconds and 3 FPS. Statistically, a 3-fold improvement over its successor and perceptibly less stutter. Time to momentously merge our assets. Can Twin Turings leapfrog a lone Ampere? By precisely 1 precious extra frame per card. equating to a 13% rise compared to its solo run, but still trailing a single 3090 by 10 FPS, with a near negligible change in render periods and supposed scaling efficiency of 56%. So a small but significant bonus? I'm skeptical because RivaTuner reported low activity on a secondary GPU, and in light of Watch Dogs Legion having been developed and optimized for DirectX 12, which we know doesn't support implicit SLI, I suspect this statistical gain is another case of coincidence as opposed to intention. But technically still better scaling than Ampere. If you want to split hairworks, yes. But if DX12 can't execute conventional SLI, and a pair of 3090s shows no evidence that this game innately utilizes more than one graphics card, how do dual Titans yield any benefit or show even the slightest sign of parallel usage? Without knowing the exact way APIs interact with their underlying mechanics, I couldn't give a definitive answer, but perhaps a programmer started writing the code and either got bored or demanded too high a paycheck. There appear to be many claiming that this game performs considerably better with DX11. Let that be their prerogative. And that DX12 offers next to no graphical enhancements. Look, if Ubisoft didn't deem it viable to harness multiple GPUs via DirectX 12, I hardly think Nvidia's coders will have bothered creating driver profiles for a game that emerged over 2 decades after DirectX 11 launched. But aren't you just a little curious? To have confirmed what I know already? No. Our entire audience of 7 are dying to discover whether a game that received priority performance patches for every one of its platforms, the Windows version of which we've already installed and was coded specifically to improve speed, stability and suboptimal CPU usage under DirectX 12, and that the most profligate of enthusiasts initially struggled to get running at the fabled frequency of 60 FPS even without ray-traced reflections, and at 1/8 of the resolution we're relishing here, can at least be made to half deliver on Nvidia's promise of playability by any means necessary, and to the satisfaction of any scrupulously objective standards, which would be, well, say, 30 frames per second. A velocity most Xbox millennials would have complained was a chugfest just before their third 360 went to meet its maker in a red ring of fire after a weekend of Elder Scrolls 4. However, the epitome of silkiness to seasoned 90s Doom veterans, whose $4,800 4860X2s and Visa Local bus boards with 1 massive megabyte of RAM contrived to propel PC gaming to then unrealized pinnacles, and besides, do we dare risk forsaking fanatical impartiality for a comment section listing all the tests we skimped on? What a persuasive picture you paint. Alright. Primary GPU maxed out, auxiliary still stuck on 7%, frame rates and processing times wildly inconsistent with respective variations of almost 10 FPS and 1/10 of a second. As the traces bear out, nearly all spikes and sags occurred towards the end of the sequence and induced palpable stutter after an admittedly promising start. Are you satisfied? Disappointed. Shall we try again with DLSS, or would you rather just stare at the screen through a sieve? No. Let us instead proceed to Phase 6, and an intrinsically DirectX 11 title. But first, a few more nuggets of now likely historical reference for hearty haters of obligatory bloatware. This notoriously bug-infested title required another separate software launcher, the Epic Games Launcher, to download the game from the Epic Games Store, then be linked to both your Steam and Ubisoft Connect accounts. Beginning with the release of Tom Clancy's Division 2 in 2019, Ubisoft elected to distribute a proportion of its games exclusively via Epic's Games Store, requiring customers to create a new user account with Epic Games, link it to their existing Ubisoft account, and install Epic's proprietary launcher application in order to initially download their purchased title. Games published by Ubisoft prior to this date and purchased through Steam's online store automatically appeared in a Steam user's library and could be launched within Steam's own client app by default, whilst those acquired directly from Ubisoft's or Epic's store, regardless of their exclusivity or release date, needed to be manually added, with both still requiring either the Epic launcher or Ubisoft Connect to run. Moreover, Additional downloadable content bought directly from Epic or Ubisoft was neither recognised by Steam nor compatible with the latter platform's distribution of its attributed game. And now, let us savour the sixth thick slice of this oven-baked bench-off. Far Cry New Dawn. An intermediary and unnumbered episode of the Far Cry series, set almost 2 decades after its forerunner's downbeat finale, and charting the progress of survivors in the apocalyptic aftermath of nuclear devastation, attempting to ward off hordes of nefarious bandits and reconstruct their community. A traditional cocktail of explosive, up-close and first-personal maiming, mauling, slaughter, havoc, destruction and death, with a gamut of weapons to match. As once again we drift in a typically disembodied state over the idyllic abodes of our stalwart survivors, all festooned in flourishing foliage peppered with pink florals, through a residence thriving with prosperity and embodying domestic bliss, across an open fireplace, ouch, that was hot, and into a tranquil garden where a playful pooch trots past some hippie graffiti, floating over a heavily fortified fence stationed with watchful sentinels, to reveal a starkly contrasting scene of clamorous chaos and carnage as a helicopter lifts off and launches missiles into a flaming forest clearing, where virtuous allies and vengeful hostiles armed to the elbows with an eyeful of rifle engage in a brutal exchange amidst volumetrically voluminous clouds of smoke and alluringly luminous lens flares. All Far Cry for the course. Let me know when it's safe to talk. Please, friend, furnish us with facts. Does a solitary 3090 make good by its master's pie-in-the-sky sales pitch? At the high-quality preset, the pastry is barely half-baked. But is it free of unsightly lumps? An average rate of 34 FPS with a maximum to minimum deviation of 13 and image renders ranging from 25 to 35 milliseconds. Not excessive discrepancies, but enough to cause perceptible jerkiness from start to finish. And does SLI ding in a sibling rectify these shortcomings? No, but it repeats them with remarkable accuracy, all stats within a rasterized Rizzler of each other. Some concurrent GPU usage reported, but asymmetric loads of 99 and 30% ultimately yielding a net loss of 1 frame per second across the board relative to our solo run. Our first clear demonstration of negative scaling, meaning when 2 chips work worse than 1. Time to tighten things up, methinks. What does a lone Turing bring to the table? Exactly 10 frames fewer per second than a Mono 3090, but in buttery or spluttery motion. 26% slower, with render durations oscillating between 40 and 50 milliseconds and frequencies varying by up to 9 FPS. Less deviation than with Ampere, but still sufficient to induce noticeable judder. But with DirectX 11 and the aid of a clinically customized driver profile, can 2 golden oldies trump their spiritual offspring by a slim but still credible margin? 5 frames or 15% fleeter versus a single or dual 3090s, but a veritable quantum leap of 15 FPS or 56% in comparison to one Titan, with both GPUs operating at close to their capacity. So our venerable vintage partnership chalks up their second victory, trailing by 2 to 4, whilst a certain Mr. Huang remains 1 birdie for 5 green bogeys. Advancing to round 7. 3D Mark Fire Strike. A synthetic benchmark suite with a lineage that took root in the positively primitive winter of 1998, when DirectX was on its 6th Spartan incarnation. Since when I've squandered more hours than my square eyes would care to recall, staring at turtles clamber out of streams, fluorescent spirits floating through forests, leviathans leaping over jet-propelled carracks, spacecraft soaring through fields of flaming asteroids, or indeed, giant columns of volcanic rock crossing broadswords with spectral humanoids, whilst squinting for the tiniest sliver of an artifact when I could simply have been playing games. The notorious Firestrike test consists of 3 sequences, rendered in real time at progressively higher resolutions, with this ultra variant defaulting to 4K and intended to utilize the power of top-tier graphics hardware up to and beyond its pixel pumping parameters. If your Uber rig is too cool for Crysis, or at least under 60 degrees, then why not let this colossus cripple its cause? In fact, there are 4 separate tests within Firestrike comprising 2 graphics and 1 physics, with the latter being devised solely to tax the CPU, along with 1 further unified benchmark. Since we're expressly concerned with the credentials of our video cards, we'll only be taking the GPU score into account. So, my staunch statistician, does Ampere's coup de grace turn promotional preaching into pixelated perfection? Considering this is a purposefully unplayable benchmarking utility, including it in an investigative feature that seeks to evaluate the veracity of statements relating to interactive gaming is a questionable call. Do we or not have a big 6 and a fat 0? Nope, but you've got a huge 6.0. Pardon? The initial test is in 2 parts, and the second animated sequence is the least demanding of all 3. But frame rates throughout range from a maximum of 20 to a minimum of 4 per second. King Harold's holiday snaps fed through a steam-powered slide projector would still make this feel slow. Is there any hope or scope for smoothness? Draw times rising to 0.2 of a second from lows of around 45 milliseconds and sequential variations of up to 80 ms and 5 fps. A unicyclist pedaling across a cattle grid against a 50-mile-an-hour headwind whilst playing Tetris on a Game Boy might define this as smooth, if his bike had a square wheel. Does a discrete duplicate salvage any dignity from this disaster? As we already know, DirectX 11 can't apply explicit SLI and thus provides no functional foundation for multiple 3090s, more misreported activity on the second GPU with unbalanced workloads of 99 and 20%, resulting in 24 token marks on the scoreboard which we can comfortably account for within a margin of error. Turning eagerly to Turing. Does one Titan tally with our target? Barely 1/10 of it. 4 frames or 34% slower on average than Ampere, with image renders reaching almost half a second and deviations of up to 4 FPS and 300 ms, all of which is reflected in the lower score. Statistically a narrow disparity in frame rate, but the constantly longer intervals make any acute changes more observable. And can cohabiting colossi fulfill where their descendants failed? A very different and encouraging story, both cards exhibiting closely matched workloads, engendering an average rise of 7 frames per second, render times topping out at 300 milliseconds and dipping to 40, with fluctuations reduced to 120 ms but elevated to 6 fps. Scarcely what any unbiased critic would describe as smooth, but near-perfect scaling efficiency, a graphics score 20% higher than its successor, and an astounding 99% gain over itself as a soloist. Our third manifest example of SLI profiles for an older DX11 application only being exploitable by cards predating Ampere's release. And a result that tightens the scoreline more than most sagacious technophiles could ever have foreseen. Turing Towers now trails by 1 slim test with every pixel still to play for in our 3 remaining rounds, whilst Nvidia's virtuous CEO balloons his 6th of 7 penalties over the resizable bar. Accelerating with intense anticipation to episode 8 in our savage civil war of semiconductivity, we have... But before that, another flurry of footnotes published for posterity. During several benchmarks, dual GPUs attained scaling of over 100%. These results are spurious, and might well be a consequence either of A, Nvidia's Shadowplay recorder negatively impacting speed to a greater degree throughout solo card runs, or B, the primary video card being located in the motherboard's lower PCIe slot, thereby potentially increasing the latency of data transmissions received from the system's CPU and causing it to underperform during specific single GPU benchmarks. If true, this would mean that when a second card was installed in the upper slot, relative performance increased by over 100%. For example, in the 3D Mark Firestrike test, one Titan RTX achieved a score of 1683, whilst adding a second card raised this figure by 103.2%, or 3,420. Dividing the latter total by 2 gives us a value of 1,710, the theoretical score achieved by one GPU when operating in SLI. Since scaling efficiency is calculated by dividing this number by the score obtained from our actual single card benchmark, and then multiplying the output by 100, The result of 101.6% implied that one card was performing at 98.4% of its optimum potential, whilst also giving the false impression that two GPUs configured in SLI were exceeding their maximum simultaneous workloads by 1.6%. Effectively relocating the primary card to the upper PCIe slot by connecting it to the host system's display and rerunning the affected benchmarks resolved 4 rogue results by posting true single GPU scores that surpassed their estimated counterparts in SLI, thereby also yielding a concurrent average utilization of under 100%. Both motherboard slots were full-length, electrically linked to all 16 lanes and, as verified by GPU-Z, operating in times 16 Gen 3 mode throughout every test. And now, onto Port Royal. Officially recognised as the world's inaugural dynamically path-traced test targeting gaming technology's graphical zenith, set against the spectacular backdrop of an interstellar space station, replete with myriad mirrored surfaces and spooky zombified entities with glowing eyes and shiny complexions, clothed in a curious concoction of orange bodysuits and butlers' uniforms, and who appear to become eerily aware of your presence as the picture fades to black. All intended to exemplify John Turner Whitted's elegant algorithm in its most captivating form. This benchmark comprises 2 sequences, the first of which is a pre-rendered demo which we'll pass over in the interests of priceless time, whilst the second is the actual graphics test, though again both indigenously non-playable, thus once more I'd query their presence within an analysis that purports to review the exactitude of a gaming product's promotion. Please dispense with the suspense and supply the stats, 60 or no 60. Just a shade over 10% thereof, with a frequency range of 6 to 12 FPS and processing times stabilizing at around 140 milliseconds. Consecutive variances not as pronounced as with Firestrike, but still about as fluid as a flip chart presentation. And what happens when we double the amplitude? Both GPUs loaded to their limits, generating a 7-frame or 99.7% boost in average speed, with spikes reaching 24 and sags down to 9 FPS. Render times ranging from 30 to 150 milliseconds and slashed by 50% overall, with sequential deviations of up to 70 ms and 4 FPS. Both wider than for one card and equally perceptible despite definitive performance increase and close to optimal concurrent efficiency. Efficient perhaps, but with power consumption approaching that of a travel toaster, far from eco-friendly. Onto our Imperial Elders. Can Uno Titan upset the Ampere cart? Prepare to be disenchanted. A 40% or 3-frame decrease compared to 13090, with record high draw times alongside fluctuations exceeding 0.3 of a second and 3 FPS, as is illustrated by the spikier trace, meaning that even Turing's fastest image renders and frame rates can barely match the minimums of its successor. About as choppy as it gets outside of Gordon Ramsay's kitchen. And how about a towering twosome? Render times reduced to a range of 90 to 400 ms, with maximum sequential discrepancies narrowed by 50 milliseconds but raised to 4 FPS, whilst all 4 values remain higher than for a single 3090. 2 gold stars for combined efficiency and a performance increase equaling that of its successor, but the relative deficit remains at 40% and the vast variation between long and short intervals precludes any semblance of smoothness and ultimately posts a score over 1000 marks lower. A newer DX12-based benchmark with explicit multi-GPU support present, parading the peak powers of natively implemented SLI over the NVLink interface for generations Turing and Ampere's flagships, though the latter's architectural advancements and additional subcomponents earn it a decisive victory. Along with an unassailable 5-3 lead in this super heavyweight clash for graphical glory, Turing now playing for pride and Jensen Huang praying for a sliver of credibility. Phase 9 commencing in 3, 2, Deus Ex, Mankind Divided. The 4th in the Deus Ex Chronicles, and another futuristic first-person blast fest purporting to combine elements of high-octane action and cerebral role-playing with a dialogue-driven narrative, and centered around the misadventures of semi-synthetic human hacker Adam Jensen. And no prizes for guessing why this box of options and ensuing promotional preamble appears so vividly reminiscent. These developers and publishers are nothing if not pervasively brand conscious. We materialise within a bleak and windswept street market, starkly lit by garish downlights, bare bulbs and fluorescent tubing, and commandeered by menacing militia, mostly clad from head to foot in heavy suits of sophisticated armour. Past a greengrocer's stall we glide, piled high with prized marrows, giant carrots, shapely pears and opulent cabbages. A plethora of polystyrene litter lies scattered across the saturated ground as we silently pass through an open staircase to observe a shifty merchant's abundant array of firearms and ammunition, set beside crates filled with liberal supplies, where two cyborg-like ladies exchange small talk beneath substantial hunks of hanging meat. Another trader crouches nervously beside hemp sacks brimming with rice, oats, barley and other starchy staples. As we sidle by a hulking exosuit, through a threadbare shelter populated with ailing hostages, and out again to our moody street scene where one captive mourns a fallen friend, seemingly begging her faceless and unflinching captor for mercy beneath the hovering drone camera's omnipresent watch. No data traces are generated by this benchmark, so we'll be relying solely on its final figures and RivaTuner's real-time reporting. Please divulge the stats for a single ampere. Is it a sweet 60? More like a sour semi. Without expounding too much further, in the interests of common decency, is this semi a creamy treat or a crusty trick? To a collector of CRT TVs with an archive of recorded broadcasts from the late 20th century, this would equate to playback paradise. A solid average frequency of 27 FPS with a low to high range of 7 and oscillations of no greater than a single frame, whilst render durations reside in a window of 10 milliseconds with no image on screen for longer than 40. And do we double up to delight? Or deceive? The former, and with interest. Balanced GPU usage of between 65 and 99%, providing a unified efficiency of 88 and raising frame rates by 20 per second or 74% compared to a solo setup. Draw times spiking to 30 and sagging to 15 milliseconds with wider sequential variations of 12 ms and 4 fps, which introduces some micro-stutter but not enough to negatively impact fluidity, and the net speed increase provides a more than polished visual experience. A tough act to follow and no mistake, but can maturity triumph over talent? What can one wily old titan crank out? A reduction of 7 frames per second or 26%, lows and highs around 16 and 23 FPS with render times of 15 milliseconds, peaking at 60 and dropping to 45. Consecutive discrepancies matching amperes, and even at a frequency below 20 FPS, intervals this consistent can generate arguably fluid animations, though according to slowly recovering market value in these times of shameless scalping, broken supply chains, Bitcoin avarice, and lackluster production models, each frame will set you back over $100, assuming you already own an Uber computer and 8K display. So it pays for itself within a second. Mindless optimism, worthy of a Satanist's faith healer. And if I dared dream that 2 rings forged a divine matrimony, would my prayers be answered? Identical levels of parallel activity demonstrating a stable integration of explicit SLI and elevating performance by 13 frames or 72% above a single GPU, but with scaling efficiency a shade shy of dual 3090s. Peaks and troughs of 24 and 42 FPS and average render durations reduced by 36% with consecutive fluctuations topping out at 10 ms and 3 FPS. Numerically narrower margins than for Ampere, but visually no more impressive by virtue of Turing's lower overall speed, though again smooth by any neutral definition. So to conclude, In order to play 5-year-old games at 8K with a $1,500 video card and obtain higher frame rates than gamers using an 8-year-old $400 console experience, but still falls markedly short of Mr. Huang's headstrong guarantee, you need a second $1,500 video card. Time for our final and decidedly anticlimactic rop-off, with Ampere having ambled past the winning post, Turing teetering on the precipice of humiliation, and General Jensen facing dishonourable downscaling under the Frames Descriptions Act. Prepare for vintage revitalisation in Quake 2 RTX, a ravishingly ray-traced remastering of ID Software's timeless classic, whose inaugural incarnation again served to parade the pioneering aesthetics of hardware-accelerated 3D graphics. Back in the day when SLI stood for Scan Line Interleave, and DirectX 6 couldn't hold a blocky candle to the finely filtered eye candy of OpenGL or Glide. An intricate plot casts the player as one surviving Marine in the aftermath of a devastating attack upon his heroic cohorts, stranded on the hostile planet of his ruthless assailants and compelled to navigate 10 labyrinthine levels of gloomy corridors and hallways, sneak through sliding doors and scurry down secret passages, deftly negotiate moving platforms, traverse aerial promontories, and crawl amidst complexes of subterranean caverns on a do-or-die mission to vanquish the savage Strogg race's supreme leader and salvage humankind from irreversible destruction. Metallic warriors lurk in all darkened alcoves, with mutated beasts poised to pounce round every dingy corner, meeting fists with claws, pistols with pincers, rocket launchers with rifles, chain and railguns, while every flash, flame and projectile casts luminous orbs of coloured light across seamlessly textured scenery. And here, in an embodiment of impassioned nostalgia, retrospective reveries are realised in recursively remixed resplendence. Regard the sublime illumination, swoon over the subtler shadows, stare in spellbound rapture at the copious gamut of high-def hues and sumptuous gradations, from topaz golds to rusty reds and coppery browns to lichen greens. As your monstrous foes revel in newly enlightened rage, ignited with a newfound lividity, steel plates, riveted tiles, and vented panelling all emit a soft sheen, with every pane of gleaming glass a translucent vignette of hyperrealism, eliciting nuanced atmospherics, enriching old haunts with fresh character, fathomless dimension, and breath-snatching authenticity, and appropriately run here under Vulkan. Indeed, the API I like to think of as OpenGL's inspired successor, since the latter's severely declined presence within the gaming sector, and during its early stages of development was colloquially christened OpenGL Next. Based upon a mantle its non-profit authors Khronos inherited from AMD, this innovative and practical interface eventually launched in 2016 with comprehensive cross-platform compatibility and pedal-to-metal control for the most resourceful programmers to optimally harness their industry's latest and greatest technology. Like DirectX 12, Vulkan can inherently utilize multiple GPUs, and given this revamped homage was part of a momentous mass reimagining project, mobilized under the auspices of NVIDIA's dedicated subsidiary Lightspeed Studios, I suspect that explicit SLI will have been implemented to the nth degree. As a consequence, and on account of our 3 indigenously engineered benchmarks thus far, those being Tomb Raider, Strange Brigade, and 3D Mark Port Royal, the results should be a foregone conclusion. Thus, in the interests of preserving a sliver of suspense, let's take this opportunity to reveal them in order of what I anticipate shall be choppiest to chirpiest. Beginning, if you please, with Titan times 1. What are the odds of 60 fields per 1 million nanoseconds? About the same as Jason Voorhees replacing his machete with a feather duster. So not quite nil then. A little lower then, but considering this is the concluding test, let's try and attribute some chronological perspective to the pixels and price tags. Currently pictured on your mega-wide aspect panels is an ATI Expert at Play 98, an AGP relic from back in the day when there truly was a Team Red. AMD were manufacturing processors that slid into slots, and PCI Express was mistaken for a priority courier service. It was founded on the company's Rage 3D Pro chip, launched in 1997, and one of the earliest capable of elevated 3D graphics, being an architectural descendant of the then 3-year-old Rage 2, and adding a moderate selection of hardwired effects. To run games as visually evolved as Quake 2, it initially had to rely on ropey beta drivers with subpar support for OpenGL, which, even following subsequent optimizations, failed to elicit a level of performance that either tallied with ATI's claims or satisfied the card's target demographic. Nonetheless, when partnered with a Ninja PC of the era, at a resolution of 1024 by 768, you'd have got a comparatively respectable 12 frames per second for a mid-term investment of $250. Fast forward 2 decades to the Titan RTX, a product officially pitched at computer scientists and professional creators, but armed with Turing's most powerful variant, faster in all respects than its most capable consumer counterpart, and bearing a bounty over twice as exorbitant. In this post-millennial modernization of Quake 2, the aforementioned card will serve you a scorching 7 frames per second for 280 greenbacks per frame, assuming a market value of $2,000 based on average eBay/Amazon secondhand and refurbished prices, with processing times maxing out at over 200 milliseconds from a base of 100, and consecutive variations of 1 FPS and 60 ms. Out of context, not a worst-case scenario, but when considering every separate image is taking at least 200% longer than that to render, jerkier than a jerk driving a dragster over Giant's Causeway.
What an atrociously forced analogy.
I haven't even started.
A good thing will soon be finished. Can Titanic Twins line a rasterized cloud with ray-traced silver?
Before we detonate that bombshell, let's take another dive into the crudely dithered Dark Ages. The practically proportioned, discreetly appointed, malted milk-colored PCB you're scrutinizing is an Asus V3400, a rebadged reference design from the most prolific board partner in history, incorporating NVIDIA's maiden Riva TNT chip. Itself conceived to transcend 3DFX's venerable and formidable Voodoo 2, but ultimately falling short of this aim due to excessive temperatures necessitating a pre-retail core frequency reduction. Furthermore, despite boasting a decidedly broader graphical feature set than ATI's rival offerings, the TNT also compared unfavorably to its dedicated contemporary in Quake 2 and other titles programmed with OpenGL, due to the lack of a home-harvested equivalent to Glide, and thus its unabridged reliance upon an independently evolved API. Despite such hindrances, when tasked with ID's seismic sequel inside a sufficiently high-spec rig running at the same optimal dimensions, this visionary vintage would have churned out 30 passable frames per second for a decidedly modest down payment of $199. Teleport to 2018 and the question of how much bang you could buy for over 25 times that budget. Let's first focus on the positives. 2 cards emphatically faster than 1, demonstrating the game's diligent coding and Vulkan's functional versatility. Both GPUs occupied to capacity, inducing an average speed boost of 86% and raising 6 frames to 13 per second, with a collective total usage of 96%. High and low rates doubled, draw times halved with deviations of 10 milliseconds and 1 FPS, tighter intervals than for a single card, but the same oscillations in frequency. Moving from raw figures to real finances, your cash-to-render ratio for this setup equates to $308 per frame, computer not included. Relative to our Riva, that amounts to a 4,567% increase in image tax for the privilege of under half the performance.
One very expensive second, proving that time is indeed a precious thing. So let's move swiftly on to empirical matters.
Not quite yet. First, another trawl through the Trilinear archives. Meet the Myro High Score 3D2, rocking 3DFX's venerable Voodoo 2 chipset, a turbocharged descendant of its trend-setting predecessor, sporting a colossal 12MB frame buffer. When running OpenGL-coded games, 3DFX cards initially used a customized and heavily streamlined Mini-GL wrapper, deriving only a handful of features from its ancestral API, all of which were functionally adapted for the company's proprietary Glide platform, which at the time was both a technically superior and more broadly adopted solution throughout the gaming market. In the waning winter of 1998, a pair of these plain vanilla PCI pixel pumpers, configured in scan line interleave within a tall beige tower alongside an uber-overclocked Celeron 300A, any guru gamer prepared to part with $600 of hard-earned high interest would have anticipated between 60 and 70 frames of Quakin Stevens per second, at the Ultra HD equivalent of 1024 by 768. Warping through a wormhole to autumn 2020, and progress picks up just above where we left. A 1.5 frame gain over two Titans with image renders no longer than 75 milliseconds and consecutive variations slashed by 50% to 5 ms, but remaining at 1 FPS, again proving that without the former figure the latter is meaningless. More than twice as fast as its forerunner in singles competition and, for the first time in 9 tests, outmatching Twin Turing's as a solo GPU by 11%. Though, at the volatile market value of $1,500, this converts to an exchange rate of $103 per frame, plus PC. A veritable steal compared to its immediate elder, but from a profoundly nostalgic perspective, 3 times the price for 1/5 of the Voodoo magic.
Back in a bygone era when PC gaming's keenest connoisseurs would employ something known as a landline to contact their local branch of a bricks-and-mortar chain store and instruct its proprietor to stash their prospective purchase beneath the counter for a frugal deposit, before physically leaving their houses and drawing the balance in fresh bills from a nearby cash point. Hopping on a bus with a pounding heart, disembarking one stop early, sprinting down a high street replete with thriving retailers, through hordes of Saturday shoppers, and into the premises of their hardware haven where they declare in a proud tone, "I've come to collect my Creative Labs 3D Blaster Voodoo 2. The 12MB version.
Might I assume you were one such connoisseur?
I remember the clothes I was wearing, the time of the phone call, the weather, the bus number, the name of its driver, and the look on the face of the Nintendo fanboy who just splurged 3 months of wages for an N64. Now it seems only the hallowed halls of Micro Center could afford such a refreshingly offline experience.
What about the Apple Store?
Indeed. A place where graphics cards that look like breeze blocks are sold at 6 times the price of their peasant-branded counterparts, and that the buyer must pledge only ever to utilize for Metal API benchmarks, or else they might discover they're slower for everything else, including all the games that a Mac user is too cool to play. And now, drawing these dragged-out proceedings to a grinding conclusion, what happens when we vulcanize 2 amps?
Before that, one final shuffle through Fong-shaded history. Introducing the GeForce 256, pictured here in its ultimate guise, courtesy of Asus, who took formerly unprecedented measures to materially enhance NVIDIA's default specification by supplanting the suggested SD-RAM with 32 megabytes of super low latency SG-RAM, maximizing the overclocking capacity of a design that had demonstrably benefited from additional memory bandwidth. The chip itself was promoted as the world's first wholly self-sufficient GPU, with hardware-accelerated transform and lighting serving as the star attraction amongst a gamut of integrated effects. a groundbreaking accomplishment that marked the start of NVIDIA's meteoric rise to prominence, and paved the way to its predatory takeover of 3DFX 2 years later, a contentious and highly litigious acquisition that aroused fervent debate throughout the tech media and garnered unanimous condemnation from every enthusiast eagerly awaiting their Voodoo 56000. As Y2K was poised to wreak binary cyber havoc upon software silicon and civilization, the Emerald Empire's founding fraggers would have been blasting barrels and slaughtering Macron's boss Strogs in pixel-perfect pan and scan at 100+ frames per second for the civil donation of $250. Here, in the present past, 2.5 decades later, at the impending gold standard of 8K, we witness Ampere's dynamic duo deliver a 10-frame or 72% performance rise over Uno 3090, and lift the latter's existing lead over two Titans to 92%. Concurrent workloads close to their limits, converting to a combined total occupancy of 86%. A fraction less efficient than two Titans, but Ampere's architectural superiority means that a second card exponentially increases its advantage. Render times trimmed to a range of 35 to 45 milliseconds, with sequential deviations reaching 12 ms and 2 fps. Spikier intervals and frequency fluctuations, but overall speed increase more than compensates for minuscule microstutter. And all for the unmissable bargain of $120 per frame, based on market value of $3,000 for two cards. This is the only configuration of our quartet that provides either passably smooth visuals or remotely adequate responsiveness, but the flat frame traces throughout all 4 runs imply that the benchmark sequence is not especially demanding, containing only moderate amounts of animated activity. Clustered explosions, roomfuls of enemies, and more detailed environments would likely trigger another slideshow. Dispensing with deep-learned spiel and dithering ray-traced rhetoric into rasterized reality, we are obtaining approximately 1/4 of last-century speed for 12 times the price, and around half of NVIDIA's promised performance for double thereof. Even when factoring in inflation or unforeseen circumstances, this breed of corporate profiteering makes highway robbery seem perfectly civilized. And that's just in one title from a randomly picked portfolio. So, to succinctly address the 3 questions posed at the start of this obsessively assiduous analysis, along with our now deceased listener's innocent request to quell his personal quandary, Bill, if by lucky chance your beard has not yet grown into your ears, your brother's bequeathed Samsung QN900A may well fit the bill for broadcasts, Blu-rays and box binges, but if frame gains and game fame are all you crave in 8K, Nvidia's claims amount to stuttering shame.
The 3090 is so big that for the very first time, we can play games at 60 frames per second in 8K.
Declared the gospel according to St. Jensen. Though unfiltered facts and objective scrutiny reveals that the Titan RTX realized this feat 2 times out of 9 attempts, Strange Brigade and Rainbow Six Siege, and needed SLI in both cases to do so, whilst its slavishly hyped and now humbled successor managed it once with a single card, Strange Brigade again, and thrice when partnered up, but only if we count Tom Clancy twice, which never actually utilized the second GPU. Even had Hong halved his rebel-rousing hokum and stated, games would be playable at 30 FPS in 8K, our independent study of 9 randomly cherry-picked benchmarks would still show Nvidia's head honcho racking up 4 booms for 5 busts, with 2 of those strikes severely stretching the definition of objective smoothness. True, no reference was ever made to quality settings, and perhaps by turning off textures and dialing down draw distances, truncating anti-aliasing, jacking up jaggies, simplifying shadows, revoking reflections, removing objects, reducing lavish lighting, and forfeiting every fancy real-time effect that collectively conceived and embodied the RTX brand, and were touted as Ampere's unique selling points, then 60 frames per second at 8K might have odds of under 8 million to 1.
Regrettably, in this antisocial construct of cutthroat corporate unity, just as a broken clock can be right once a day, one sliver of selective truth can transcend a tsunami of falsehoods. Then and now, in the historic future, with the GPU market poised on the precipice of long-awaited parity, Intel arcing to enter the foray, and unscrupulous scalpers struggling to flog their ill-gotten silicon to increasingly savvy buyers, there's surely one lesson that this excruciatingly protracted examination will have taught those 3 patient audience members who managed not to perish from old age. That being, any corporate carnivore worth their weight in potentially plummeting stock will stop at no amoral means to balance its books, whether by financially exploiting the fallout of a global pandemic or plugging the tiniest pinhole in a prohibitive product stack to fob the bankrupted user off with resoundingly lesser bang for repugnantly larger buck. And now, an exclusive addendum of charted facts for those viewers with saintly patience, because we simply couldn't sign off another retrospective episode without tying up every last loose Lovelace by establishing whether or not Ampere's empirical successor can deliver upon a 2-year-old pledge that, curiously, its paternal CEO made not the slightest allusion to throughout a comparatively Spartan online presentation, during which 3 Ada-fortified fabrications were announced, with 1 allegedly overpriced and underspecified rogue subsequently suspended due to a savage community backlash. A 470 Ti in 480s clothing, so claimed millions of incensed upper mainstreamers. The RTX 4090 card used for this strictly regulated assessment was Zotac's recurring Trinity-branded Amp Extreme Aero Edition, with all frequencies and voltages left at their factory settings. For this turbocharged incarnation, Zotac administers an out-of-the-box velocity bonus, raising NVIDIA's founding stock boost core speed of 2520 MHz to 2580, and thereafter elevating this value to the limit permitted by the GPU's rated TDP of 450 watts. All tests were conducted using the same quality profiles as for Turing and Ampere, with DLSS and ray tracing uniformly disabled, with exception to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where the former was activated via the game's launcher. For reference and the benefit of those not willing to navigate the progress bar, these presets were as follows: Assassin's Creed High Default, Shadow of the Tomb Raider High Default with DLSS enabled at the launcher, Strange Brigade Custom Default, which auto-selects Ultra for texture detail and Medium for all other options. Watch Dogs Legion Very High Default. Far Cry New Dawn High Default. 3D Mark Firestrike Ultra Default. 3D Mark Port Royal Default. Deus Ex Mankind Divided High Default. Quake 2 RTX. Custom Settings. Global Illumination High. Reflection, Refraction Depth 1. Next 6 options, yes. Texture filtering, anisotropic. Thick glass refractions, enabled. Projections, perspective. In Quake 2, the RTX 4090 was initially almost 150 and 400% faster as a single GPU than the Titan and 3090 configured in SLI, with both the latter NV-linked pairings fully occupied, and double as fast again, yes, that's 3 and 8 times quicker, compared to its architectural predecessor's solo card runs. This exceptionally large gap was induced by NVIDIA's latest drivers, 522.25, which were stated to provide significant performance gains for DirectX 12 workloads, and were the inaugural revision to support Lovelace GPUs. After updating both Ampere and Turing's top dogs with the same driver set, each older GPU yielded respective gains of 120 and 185% relative to their own previous solo efforts, whilst also improving by 125 and 180% upon their existing SLI results. These disproportionate increases were not reflected within any of the other 7 benchmarks. And finally,
Despite multiple reboots and clean driver reinstalls, all attempts to run Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege froze at the benchmarks load screen, failing to generate any data, whilst 3D Mark's Port Royal incurred insurmountable slowdown during the second real-time test, which negatively impacted the score to an intolerably misleading degree. Though Afterburner and RivaTuner recorded an average frame rate of 83 per second for the initial demo sequence, which bested both the Titan and 3090's single card results by 50 frames per second, or 170%.
Can I go now, please?
You